1,000 of the wounded and vulnerable escape Aleppo, but several are shot and tens of thousands remain trapped. Good evening. It has at least begun. After 4 years of mayhem, an evacuation orchestrated by the Syrian Red Crescent and the Russians, insecure enough to allow the shooting and wounding of some at the hand of Iranian-backed militias who disapproved. Once again, the United Nations has been excluded, but a process may now have been established to get people out of Aleppo. And Turkey is now building a new holding camp capable of containing 100,000 refugees from Aleppo up inside the northern Syrian border. Tonight, the latest.
Also on tonight's programme, the Department of Work and Pensions says it has stopped JD Sports from using job centres to recruit workers after an undercover investigation by this programme revealed shocking conditions. Tonight, we have more. Theresa May gets the cold shoulder in Brussels as the other EU leaders dine without her. Is this how Britain will be treated after Brexit?
Plus, we talked to one of the greatest actresses of our age, Glenda Jackson. Left the stage at 50 to become a Labour MP. Fond of, yet despairing of Corbyn, she's finally back on stage as King Lear to massive acclaim at 80.
It is the most extraordinary play. The way they are sort of unpeeled before your very eyes. These characters you think you know to begin with, at the end they're completely different, and truthfully different.
They are exhausted, they are disillusioned, they're in very bad shape. But they have finally escaped rebel-held Aleppo, the Red Cross says, after a convoy of buses and ambulances carried some 1,000 civilians out of the besieged enclave, with more vehicles already on the way. But there was chaos this morning when an initial convoy came under fire, leaving several people hurt. We should warn you, there are distressing images in this report by our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman.
Threading their way through the rubble, 10 ambulances and some 20 buses, evacuating almost 1,000 civilians from eastern Aleppo, taking them to relative safety, but at enormous risk. Because yesterday's ceasefire collapsed, and this one almost did the same, when pro-government forces opened fire shortly after it began. A child waves goodbye to his ruined city. A man accompanies his prized birds, the most valuable possession he can carry. The UN is not in charge here, though the International Red Cross is monitoring and called this a positive first step. Early this morning, amid the sound of gunfire, our camerawoman, Wad Al-Khatib, filmed an injured man lying in a hospital courtyard, waiting for the evacuation to begin.
Now the cars is full of civilians and the injuries. They are all will go.
Packed in one ambulance are women and children desperate to escape. And Wad travels with them.
We are waiting with the cars and the civilians and the injuries and their families. Now we are hearing sounds of weapons. We don't know what's happened now, but actually all civilians and injuries in their cars are afraid.
This convoy has come under direct fire, so newly injured civilians are driven back where they've come from for medical help.
ايش صار معكم عمو؟ شو يا اخي؟ ايش صار معكم؟
شو والله اعطيني مشي.
جبنا بالسيارة راح يضربوا علينا بالطريق.
اعطيني طريق حجينا.
مين اللي ضرب عليكم؟
تفضل تفضل. تعالوا.
طب ايش اللي انضرب عليكم؟
وصلوا لي على عائلتي وين ولسه راح بيتكم.
يلا هلا دقيقة. كنا بالسيارة مشان نطالع الجرحى. نحن واقفين قوس علينا. قوس علينا أكثر من مرة، صار مقوس علينا 3 مرات. كنا نروح ونرجع آخر ما بيه وهو مقوس علينا ضربني وأنا بدخل بالصحية.
سيارات الإسعاف والمصابين الموجودين هناك شو صار فيهم؟
أزلوا كثير. في عالم يعني فرط بالأرض ما عاد يقدر يشيلها.
المهم طلعنا ودينا جبنا ابو الاسعاف وهذاك لسه على بايده هنيك ما نشوف الا قالوا ببرص هن صاروا يركضوا قناص فلت ما بقى تعرفي لا قناص ما بقى تعرفي.
طب مو منسقين مو لازم يكون
ما وافقوا الاولاد شوفي يعني الا شوي كان الاولاد كمان راحوا كلياتنا كنا رحنا هي على اساس التنسيق.
Yet there is almost nothing left to live for here. So tens of thousands are preparing to undertake the same journey. Turkish officials predicting that 50,000 will leave in the next few days, assuming there are enough buses and that the ceasefire lasts. It's true, we're leaving Aleppo, this boy says. But when we grow up, we will come back and liberate it. Me, my brothers, all of us. Amid the devastation, a woman scrawls her farewell message. We're coming back. Down with Bashar al-Assad. Syrian state television showed the official flag flying in the east of the city. Some pro-Assad militia would rather wipe the rebels out than let them escape. Though the president himself was filmed on a mobile phone outside his palace, saying history had been made.
Everybody's saying congratulations now, and all social media express the word congratulations. We do not want to repeat this word. I want to reassure you that what is happening today is history being rewritten by every Syrian citizen.
The Russians who brokered this ceasefire say rebel fighters seen mingling with civilians here will also be allowed safe passage. Civilians arriving in rebel territory this afternoon weren't subjected to government ID checks or registration, and Damascus may be happy to herd its enemies in one place, paving the way for another siege later. As for the opposition, well, judging from this video shot from a drone, they seem to know the real-life disaster movie that is Aleppo is almost over. President Assad may control only about a third of Syria, and hundreds of thousands lie dead, but this wasteland of flattened buildings is what he calls victory.
So how is the world responding? Here, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has summoned the Russian and Iranian ambassadors to express what he described as profound concern. Earlier, I spoke to Stephen O'Brien in New York. He's the head of humanitarian affairs and emergency relief at the United Nations. After some civilians came under fire trying to leave East Aleppo, I asked him how far the UN would try to hold people responsible for what has happened there.
Yes, we are also receiving reports of people who have been encouraged to go through corridors that have been set up by the combatant parties, so not by the UN, and we have not been consulted on those. And so as we get those reports, and as you hear my colleague, the High Commissioner for Human Rights equally, highlighting these reports, whether it is to do with people being diverted from the corridors of exit or whether they're being taken to one side, some allegations of torture, even some reports of executions. We need to see that there is evidence collected, gathered, preserved, and that these should be brought to a tribunal for accountability to be put in front of those who are alleged to have perpetrated these abominable potential war crimes.
President Assad has just said what's happening in Aleppo today is making history.
Well, I think it's making very much a history which we would not wish to see. But at the same time, now we've got people in need who have the ability to escape from the terrible depredations, fear and searing anxiety which they've been living under for so long. It's vital that we do everything we can to meet the needs of all those who've been caught up in this crisis through no fault of their own.
Well, to what extent are you in any position to insist on some kind of presence in and around Idlib if that becomes the new marshalling yard for these incredibly dispossessed and distressed people? And more than that, the Turks are talking in terms of a refugee camp for anything up to 100,000 people. Will you have access to that?
Well, we are discussing with the Turkish authorities, who have, of course, been very generous and have enormous experience in establishing camps, indeed in Turkey, just on the northern border with Syria. And so this discussion for potentially a camp in and around Idlib is important because it means that we can ensure not only that we have a place of safety, but a place where we can get the services and that we can properly register people who have chosen to come to Idlib. And yes, we do have people on the ground in Idlib in order to ensure that people who have grave needs are at least getting access to where those needs can be met, whether that's water or food or medical or psychosocial support. And in the camps, they're able to try to reunite with their family members, those who've survived this terrible onslaught.
And this has been the tragedy of the whole disaster centred on Aleppo, that at every turn, either the Russians or the Syrians or some other player has prevented the United Nations from having any seriously local active part in it.
Since November the 15th, we've not had any formal food supplies into eastern Aleppo. So that's over a month. People have been eking out what little they've got. We haven't had any ability, despite, for once in December, getting our UN plan for distribution of aid agreed by the government of Syria. Because of these ongoing security reasons, we've not actually been able to deliver on that or get in. And so, for all the agreements we may be able to achieve, when we're prevented, we're prevented. And that does mean that people in need simply either aren't able to survive or go hungry and are in terrible fear.
Stephen O'Brien, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Cheers, John. Thank you.
Well, the mayor of eastern Aleppo told European leaders at their summit in Brussels that more action is needed to save civilians in his city. But Syria was just one item on the European Council's agenda, with the migrant crisis and the situation in Ukraine taking up much of the meeting. The leaders won't start discussing Brexit until they sit down to dinner. But Britain won't be there. Theresa May has been told she's not invited. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Brussels now. Gary.
Well, that account of life in Aleppo that the European leaders heard earlier from the mayor of eastern Aleppo was apparently really quite harrowing. But Syria remains the last item on the communique, it looks like, from the drafts we've seen. And actually what's dominating the thoughts here is Vladimir Putin and the threats that he poses, not least on Europe's eastern flank. They were hoping, the EU leaders, that here they could send out some very strong messages towards Putin, some of the leaders at least. They have managed to renew sanctions against Russia, but at the same time, because of one of the other major concerns they have, which is populism's rise in Europe, they've been trying to send out another message on behalf of the Dutch Prime Minister. He's been trying to get a treaty, EU-Ukraine treaty, ratified by the Netherlands, and because of concerns about that, they've actually had to put out a message in the same communique. It's not out yet, but we've seen the draft, as I say, which effectively slightly cold shoulders Ukraine. So you can see the sort of tension there within the EU. And it's that ratification process, the business of trying to get every single country in Europe to sign up to something that Europe's agreed to, which is one of the reasons why a senior British official has been quoted overnight as having warned the government that an awful lot of leaders here, if not the vast majority of them, think that when it comes to Brexit, ratification and the whole business of negotiation of the future relationship means that the final endpoint, when there is a new relationship between Britain and Europe, could be really quite a lot of years away. Here's how the day went here.
The mayor of eastern Aleppo was led in to speak to Europe's leaders by the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk. But Syria hasn't dominated this summit. And when he left, the mayor said the international community was still effectively silent on the atrocities in Syria. Vladimir Putin's ghostly presence is felt in this room. They fear he could interfere in upcoming elections around Europe. They've renewed sanctions against Russia, triggered by Russia's seizure of Crimea. The leaders were addressed by another outsider, the Secretary General of NATO.
In times with uncertainty like we see now, we need strong institutions. We need institutions that build the partnership between Europe and North America.
But the institutions are shaky. Donald Trump threatens NATO solidarity, and Britain has wounded this institution.
We have underestimated the drama behind Brexit. There is a G7 country, the second economy in the single market of the European Union, a veto power of the Security Council of the United Nations, leaving the European Union. This is weakening the European Union without any doubt.
For a few moments as the talks started, Theresa May cut a friendless figure. She's heading home before dinner as the 27 countries remaining in the EU want to discuss how they'll go about organising themselves for the Brexit talks.
I welcome the fact that the other leaders will be meeting to discuss Brexit tonight, as we are going to invoke Article 50, trigger the negotiations by the end of March next year. It's right that the other leaders prepare for those negotiations as we have been preparing. We will be leaving the EU. We want that to be as smooth and an orderly process as possible.
Next door, members of the public have been touring the leader's spanking new home in Brussels, a multi-million-pound giant neon egg. But spirits here are dimmed, and the EU goes into the new year seeing threats on many fronts.
Can't hear anything. Cue me, Robert. The 27 now are going to be sitting down there having their dinner, and I don't know if you heard it in there, what Theresa May was saying there, but there's a very slight hint of criticism there. It's right that they organise themselves and get ready for the negotiations. I think there's a feeling around Theresa May a bit that there's been an awful lot of criticism of Britain not having a Brexit plan ready, but today we saw bickering really between the different institutions of the European Union, the European Parliament saying that they feel they should be represented in the room for those negotiations, and the European Council and the European Commission more or less turning around and saying no, forget it. So those tensions are there, a sense in London that maybe not all the ducks are in a row on Europe's side for these negotiations, and a sense also that we're getting a foretaste of all the divisions and fractiousness, even around process before you get to substance in Brexit.
Gary Gibbon. In the last hour, the Department of Work and Pensions says it has stopped JD Sports from using job centres to recruit workers after an undercover investigation by this programme revealed shocking conditions at its warehouse in Rochdale. Today, the company said it was launching its own investigation into working conditions. Tonight, we hear from one manager there who says despite the company's denials, she was told to sack workers on the spot and claims the culture of 3 strikes and you're out comes straight from the top. Here's our North of England correspondent, Kieran Jenkins.
If you've shopped at JD Sports this Christmas, you may have been shocked by our revelations.
No, it's more work. Prisoners get more free respect.
We revealed the reality of working at Britain's biggest sports retailer.
I want to see your arms moving!
Yesterday, JD Sports said our allegations about its vast Rochdale warehouse were untrue and not an accurate reflection of its culture. But if proved accurate, they'd be willing to investigate. Today, after seeing our footage, JD Sports begins that investigation and the process of retraining its staff. As workers and managers at the warehouse speak out for the first time. And we reveal new, exclusive footage of life inside JD Sports. We went undercover as a worker with the Assist recruitment agency. It supplies hundreds of workers to the warehouse. They toil alongside JD Sports staff. They answer directly to JD Sports managers, who enforce strict discipline by issuing strikes. 3 strikes and you could be fired.
You get strikes, you get 3 strikes, you get sacked. What are the 3 strikes? Chewing gum, matches, lighters, mobile phones.
There's a long list of things that could get you sacked.
Hoodies, incorrect uniform, anything with a logo on the front of it.
JD Sports said yesterday, we categorically do not have a strike system. Well, we've spoken exclusively to a person who says they are a member of the JD Warehouse management team.
There definitely is a 3-strike rule. You can get those 3 strikes within a matter of minutes. And if you get 3 strikes within the first hour, then you're gone. You've lost your job.
This manager asked to be anonymous. What she tells us is completely different to the public statements issued by JD Sports.
I get told I have to issue strikes. If somebody doesn't perform, they get issued a performance strike.
Inside the JD warehouse, which supplies all its UK stores, agency workers are bottom of the pile. 0 hours, minimum wage, and JD Sports bosses boast of sacking them on the spot.
Well, if you get tired, I would like to sit on a box and carry on.
No sitting down, no.
Yeah.
You get fired.
Fired?
Especially if you're sitting down.
Since last night, over 150 current and former workers at the warehouse have contacted us. Many make disturbing allegations. This is an agency worker currently employed in the warehouse.
It feels like we're all suspected thieves, and I don't like that feeling. The environment feels like a prison when you go in and out from work.
In Rochdale, up to 1,500 people work at JD Sports. Today, some have asked why they put up with it. Why not just leave? Now, this is a town of high unemployment, and we understand that the agency assists recruits directly at the job centre. If people don't take the job, they may have their benefits sanctioned. This worker says he was referred by the job centre and felt he'd be sanctioned if he turned it down.
If I didn't take the job with JD Warehouse and assist via the job centre, I think I would have lost some claim money due to the fact that it is in their claim and commitment to accept any job offers that we do get.
But they might not last long. JD Sports told us workers aren't punished for failing to meet targets called Key Performance Indicators, KPI. These are the words of a manager at the warehouse.
I've done it myself. We go around every 2 hours and we monitor everyone's KPIs, every 2 hours. And if someone's not performing, they'll be issued with a performance strike. If in the next hour they're still not performing, they'll be issued with another performance strike. They can get those strikes within minutes, following on consecutively from one to another to another. And it's not even wait till the end of the day. They're gone. From that point on, marched off the premises.
That's why, as this new footage shows, they work so hard. Our reporter wasn't issued with gloves. Workers are cut, bruised,
Put it up again.
exhausted.
Back is aching.
This woman was injured lifting boxes.
Going to health and safety? That's what they're there for.
Another worker has a head injury. A supervisor calls for a first aider. At first, there isn't one.
What's on this side? Please to get the cars towed back.
Absolutely ridiculous. I will see if I can find somebody.
Thanks.
I don't even know who you are about.
You don't know who the first aiders are?
These he doesn't do it anymore. He's by the left body.
So there's not one in each section?
Should be, but no, we haven't got one.
It takes 15 minutes for a first aider to arrive. JD Sports says it has a 4-star health and safety accreditation. It's reviewing all its policies, and it takes these allegations very seriously. But tonight, an extraordinary intervention. The Department for Work and Pensions says job centres will not recruit for JD Sports Warehouse until it's satisfied workers are being treated appropriately. It's no longer just shareholders JD Sports has to answer to, but the government.
Well, the TUC General Secretary, Francis O'Grady, joins me now. You heard there what the Department for Work and Pensions is doing. What further action do you think should be taken against JD Sports?
Well, this is disgraceful and degrading treatment by a high-profile company. But let's be clear, this isn't a bad apple. We've got a whole list of companies who are operating this kind of regime of fear against workers on 0 hours, agency and sham self-employment contracts.
You have the evidence for that?
The TUC's got a report out tomorrow showing an explosion in that kind of contract and the fear and insecurity that goes with it, and very often pitifully low pay. Now, the government may have acted on this particular case, but they should be coming down like a ton of bricks on all of these companies. They should be ending 0 hours now. They should be scrapping the employment tribunal fees that mean workers are priced out of justice. How many of those workers could afford more than £1,000 to take a case to an employment tribunal? And they should be working with unions and giving us the right to go in and organise rather than stand outside, as one of our unions is currently doing, recruiting members into union membership so that ordinary workers get a voice.
I'll come back to the union, what help you can give workers there. But, I mean, what about something like the Health and Safety Executive, for example? Is there grounds for them to sort of intervene with JD Sports?
All our experience is that where companies are offending on health and safety or pay or contracts, they're usually offending on a whole range of areas. Now, we would like the government to be resourcing our agencies properly so that the Health and Safety Inspectorate, the Minimum Wage Inspectorate, the Agency Inspectorate can get together and get around the country and get their way into these company doors and check out their books and the way that they're treating workers.
Well, I should say that JD Sports is investigating, but they do say the allegations are untrue. But I mean, coming back to you saying you want to be able to organise and get union support in for those workers, well, the problem is that you are powerless, aren't you? Because so few, I think it's around 40% of private sector employees are members of unions. So you're kind of powerless to intervene, aren't you?
We are seeing that number growing, and we've got new members at Uber, Sports Direct, and there's been a real spike in the last few weeks of people joining the GMB at this company too. So we're beginning to see that change, but it is true that the balance of power in the workplace has gone far too far in favour of the employer, and many workers are frightened to be seen even talking to a union outside the workplace, and that's why we'd like that right to go in there and talk to workers.
Shouldn't the unions take part of the blame for that? That you're not getting a surge of support. You know, you might have a spike here and there, but you're not getting a surge of support. That has to be partly, doesn't it, that although a lot of people might sympathise with what you're saying on JD Sports, then they think of Southern Rail, strikes cause misery there, there's strikes coming up on BA, the post office, you know, and they think, well, have the unions lost the plot?
I think most people agree that although striking is always the last resort, if we didn't have that right to strike, then all the power would be in the hands of the boss, and we'd get even more cases that we're seeing exposed today of the likes of sham self-employment and 0 hours contracts. So, you know, I'm proud of the work that unions are doing. We want to do more. We want to encourage people to join. But, you know, Southern Rail is a case in point. There's a strike that the workers are the last ones who want to be on strike, but this is about protecting passenger safety. And, you know, we've got an employer...
The government says that it's just a militant union that's holding passengers to ransom, and also other workers who are trying to get to work.
I think people are very well aware that we've got a company who doesn't appear to be listening to workers, prepared to come to an agreement with workers. And I really think this is the time when the Department for Transport should be encouraging Southern to come to the table and get a fair settlement, rather than, as appears to be the case, shouting from the sidelines for one side only.
I mean, finally, on JD Sports, will you be buying any of their products? Will you be shopping at their shops?
I don't think this is about consumer boycotts. I think it's about making sure that those workers get a fair deal, and the best way to do that is by joining a union.
Francis O'Grady with that message. Thanks very much. John.
Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox has agreed to a takeover deal with Sky worth more than £11.5 billion. It means Fox will buy the 61% stake in the broadcaster which it doesn't already own, in a deal which has already raised wide concerns about whether it'll give Mr Murdoch too much influence over Britain's media. Culture Secretary Karen Bradley will ultimately have to decide whether to refer it to the watchdog Ofcom, as our business editor Siobhan Kennedy now reports.
Rupert Murdoch's Fox, the US giant famed for its blockbuster movies, is hoping to expand its media empire overseas by snapping up the British TV broadcaster Sky, or at least the 2/3 of Sky it doesn't already own. Under the terms of the deal, Fox has agreed to pay £11.7 billion to acquire the remaining 61% of Sky. The deal will combine Fox TV's network and Fox Film Studio with Sky, Europe's largest pay TV broadcaster, allowing the combined company to reach 100 million households. The board of Sky has agreed to the deal, but it's likely to meet opposition from smaller shareholders who believe Sky is worth more. It's not the first time Mr Murdoch has tried to buy Sky. Back in 2011, he used his News Corp newspaper arm to try and acquire the broadcaster. The deal was politically fraught, with accusations the then Prime Minister David Cameron was too close to the Murdochs, and his Culture Secretary Jeremy Hunt was willing to usher the deal through. But then came the phone hacking scandal, and the deal was deemed too toxic to proceed. But never one to give up, Murdoch's come back again. Though the issue remains the same. Will buying Sky give Mr Murdoch too much influence of the UK media?
Sources close to Sky say they don't believe the government should refer this deal to regulators. Firstly, because with the advent of Netflix, Google and Facebook, they believe the media landscape has been significantly diluted 5 years on. And secondly, because News Corp, Murdoch's newspaper arm, has now been spun off as a separate legal entity outside Fox, albeit one which is still ultimately controlled by the Murdochs themselves.
And that's the problem. Many believe that because James Murdoch, Rupert's son, is both chairman of Sky and chief executive of Fox, that the government must refer the deal up.
I think it's reasonable to expect a review, and certainly politically, that will be the main show. There will be a lot of pressure from, as we've seen already, from the Labour Party, the SNP, and the Lib Dems to force a full review of this transaction. So you would tend to have to think that that's likely to happen.
Once Fox has formally lodged the bid in Europe, the Culture Secretary Karen Brady will have just 10 days to decide whether or not to refer the deal to the media regulator Ofcom here. The clock is ticking.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting there. The Scottish Government will not raise the top rate of tax to 50p, despite a pledge in their 2015 election manifesto. Finance Minister Derek Mackay outlined his first budget since the Holyrood Parliament gained new powers to set income tax rates. Under the new rules, Scots will become the highest taxed workers in the UK, falling into the higher rate 40% tax bracket when they start earning just over £43,000.
Let me be clear. I will not pass the costs of UK austerity on to the household budgets of the lowest income taxpayers. So I can confirm that we will protect low and middle income taxpayers at a time of rising inflation by freezing the basic rate of income tax. However, we cannot accept at this time of austerity top earners benefiting from an inflation-busting tax cut.
It is much to be regretted that he has chosen instead to hike taxes on families and businesses in Scotland, risking choking off economic recovery and depriving Scottish public services of vital tax revenue.
From The Big Short to Liar's Poker, the best-selling US author Michael Lewis certainly knows big money. But in his new book, The Undoing Project, he investigates the science of decision-making and the friendship between two psychologists in 1960s Tel Aviv. The story of how humans choose the emotion over the rational reveals a lot about money and about life. 40 years ago, two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, wrote a series of studies so breathtaking in their originality, they would literally change the world. Their research invented behavioral economics and revolutionized everything from how we spend to how we are governed. Through an intense working relationship, they grappled with why people slip up during the decision-making process. The author Michael Lewis takes up their story in his latest book, The Undoing Project, a friendship that changed our minds. Lewis has made a career of describing how people get things right. In Moneyball, he explored how baseball team, the Oakland A's, used statistics to master the art of winning.
What is happening in Oakland? It defies everything we know about baseball.
The world today certainly seems a more uncertain place than our minds are prepared to accept. A world where overconfident experts fail to predict such momentous events as Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. So what other shocks might lie ahead? How do we prepare to expect the unexpected? Michael Lewis joins us now. That uncertain world I want to come to in a moment. But these two guys, who are absolutely so extraordinary, you don't actually know, they don't know which one has actually concluded the formula that they're working on at any one time.
It was a collaboration where they could not untangle their individual contribution, and the world kept trying to do it, and they couldn't tell you. They could tell you that when they got together in a room, what they produced was distinctly different from what either one of them produced alone. And they could tell you that when they were with each other, they kind of felt unlike what they felt with other people, but they couldn't explain it.
But in short, he concludes that humans err, and he is, in your words, well, that they are two of the great error spotters of modern times.
I mean...
But surely human frailty we knew about already.
We knew that people weren't rational and that people did crazy things. What they show is the way people are systematically irrational. They all kind of make the same mistakes. that in coping with uncertainty, instead of judging probabilities, what they do is tell themselves stories. And the way they tell stories has patterns to it. And what they did was they uncovered the patterns and gave you kind of a guide to the kind of mistakes people will make.
Well, we have two shocking patterns each side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump and Brexit, both of which appear to have attracted a human herd moment.
Yeah. That's true. And you can actually look at the Trump election right through the lens of Kahneman and Tversky. I think they would say, first, that people want the world to be a more certain place than it actually is. And it's one of the reasons they're attracted when leaders sound more certain than they actually are, or financial advisors, or doctors, or experts of any sort. And that Trump's pose of total certainty and infallibility had that appeal. And I think they'd also say that he was masterful, just probably intuitively, at preying on exactly the weaknesses they spotted. They showed the way people think in stereotypes, the way they're distracted by vivid examples.
But aren't you telling us that modern technology, which is capable of producing somebody as a reality television star, capable of ringing bells that are used in circus, theatre, whatever you like, and using them politically to con them into voting for him?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's all, the best con men don't know they're con men.
So
right.
He didn't know he was doing it.
Well, it's unclear to me just exactly how conscious and strategic he is. It seems to me he's kind of making it up as he goes along, and it happened to have worked. But what would have terrified Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman was this pose of infallibility. I mean, they really do show you that the honest approach to your own mind is be a little skeptical about it, especially its gut judgments.
But then what about Brexit, where a very simple idea, leave Europe, was tested, and half the herd went for it and half the herd didn't?
What do you think about that? I don't have I think Brexit, there are things in common, but obviously between the Trump vote and the Brexit vote. And people are making these equivalences. I think it's more complicated than that. It's true in both cases, there were a lot of angry white people. And it's true that there is a kind of nationalist force on the rise. But I think that compared to Brexit, or compared to Trump, the Brexit vote seems a rational act. I mean, what we just did is, spectacularly insane. And these guys showed that, like, if people can be systematically irrational, markets can go wrong in the way they went wrong in 2008, and elections can go wrong.
Well, I think people are going to have to read it to see why they went wrong. But thank you very much indeed, Michael Lewis, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Kathy.
Thanks, John. After the break, from the stage to the Commons and back again, we speak to Glenda Jackson, who's returned from politics to acting with a starring role in King Lear that's winning huge critical acclaim.
Glenda Jackson is the Oscar-winning actress who became a Labour politician. Now, after a quarter of a century away, she's returned to the stage at the age of 80. Her performance in the title role of King Lear had such rave reviews, there's talk of her taking it to Broadway next year. I went to meet her. Glenda Jackson, thrilling a theatre, bringing them to their feet. People talking about even possibly the best King Lear they've ever seen in terms of the person playing it. I mean, what did it feel like being back?
I was surprised at how familiar it was, actually. I don't mean the actual performance, because that's always different every night. Well, that in itself is also a familiarity. Someone said to me, "You'll be okay, it's like riding a bike." And I said, no, I think it's slightly more difficult than riding a bike. But the essential generosity of actors and the kind of willingness of the theatre to accept you stays strong and real, and that made a big difference.
What was it that took you off the stage? Just a yearning for politics, or had you had enough of the job?
Anything I could have done at that time to have legally got rid of Margaret Thatcher and her government, I was prepared to have a go at. To stop what I saw and still believe was the destruction of the social interaction within our country.
Greed, selfishness, no care for the weaker, Sharp elbows, sharp knees. They were the way forward. But a woman, not on my terms.
But that passion that has sustained you from your last appearance on the stage 25 odd years ago to today is as strong as the passion which somehow drove you to compete to destroy Margaret Thatcher.
My life and lives like mine were transformed by that Labour government of 1945. A social dream was made a social reality. And that has informed, I think, all my life, and I strongly believe in the basic principles of the Labour Party.
I understand your political passion, but I can't imagine what it can be like, in a sense, to suppress this massive theatrical capacity for all that time and then come back and release it again.
You forget the play in which I came back. It's probably the greatest play that has ever been written, and it has an energy all of its own. In a strange sense, I was in solitary confinement with it for quite a long time before we started rehearsing. And when you are in that situation and you eschew all the reports of how it's been done in the past, what it means, what it's actually all about, it is the most extraordinary play. There isn't a dull, ordinary character anywhere in that play. And the whole process of the play is the way they are sort of unpeeled before your very eyes. These characters you think you know to begin with, at the end they're completely different. It's a privilege to be allowed to tackle that play.
But now that you've, as it were, re-entered the world in which we knew and loved you and admired you, how do you feel about the Labour Party now?
Is there a Labour Party now?
I ask you.
I don't know. I think what we're doing at the moment beggars belief. I think it would be nice if someone could take a decision and stand by that decision.
Jeremy Corbyn?
I'm deeply fond of Jeremy. I wrote to him when I didn't stand at the last election, and it was absolutely true to say my regret, apart from not being in my constituency anymore, was that I couldn't put him on the ballot paper for leader, because one of my beliefs is that the Labour Party should always have a left-wing representative on it. Never in a million years thinking he would be elected. Dress leadership up in any way you like, but essentially it's for people to say, this is the decision we're making, we've argued with you, we've debated with you, this is what the party agrees with. At the moment it just seems to be a lot of meetings and nothing coming out of it. This country at the moment is in one of the most extraordinary situations of its history. Here we are, poised to come out of Europe. I don't agree with many of her policies. I don't necessarily agree with some of the things she's doing, but the one thing you can't take away from our Prime Minister is that she's very clearly a grown-up, and that I think is very important. And I think having a grown-up who can see and hear alternative positions, ideas, arguments is something we have to have, not only in this country, but I think internationally as well, to stand behind some ideological banner or placard and say, in effect, well, I'm going to die in a ditch for this, without considering how many other people may die in that ditch with you, is absolutely not the way forward for the world.
Then does Labour need a grown-up?
It certainly does, yeah.
In the meantime, are you back?
One of the things that shocked me more than anything is that the situation, which was exactly the same throughout the whole of my professional acting life and the whole of the 25 years that I was out of it, is that creative writers don't find women interesting. They are rarely, if ever, the central, dramatic driving engine.
I have never said I would marry him. I have never said I would marry anyone. Never!
Your Majesty!
Enough!
And I find that quite bewildering. I don't know why. I think we're quite interesting. We're not an homogenous group. There
But
are
it's
great
not going to stop
varieties.
you.
Well, I mean, the thing that stops you is the stuff that's presented to you isn't worth doing. I mean, it's blood, sweat and tears going on that stage.
No, but we might as well recognise you're back because of Lear and because of Shakespeare.
Well, it would be nice if there was a sort of contemporaneous play of that quality around, yeah.
Glenda Jackson, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Glenda Jackson, where her King Lear ended last week, sadly. Kathy.
Now, it's 5.5 months since the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte came to power and declared war on drugs. Since then, almost 6,000 people have been killed by both police and vigilante hitmen. Photographers assigned to cover these death squad killings have been confronted by a nightly bloodbath. Our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller and his team accompanied one photojournalist, Luis Liwanag, on the streets of Manila. This report does include some graphic footage right from the start.
I'm really concerned about what's happening because with a lot of killing since even before the president stepped into office, because he promised to go on a war against drugs, there was already a spate of killings, and now almost every night like 2 or more, maybe even up to 8 or 10 people are getting killed. I see no end to this slaughter. I think the people are getting, used to it and getting desensitized already, except that they're using a different style now. Like before, it used to be like in dark streets. Now they're getting very bolder. Now it's like right in the center of the busy street.
The war on drugs was declared by a no-nonsense former city mayor, Rodrigo Duterte, when he became president in July. Luis has been covering it for weeks on end.
Luis, are you still shocked when you come to a scene like this?
Initially, no. You forget about, it's like you're in a trance. But later on, when it starts to sink in, you start remembering the body, the expression. It's really horrible the way people are being killed. Tricycle driver. If it's daily happenings, everything seems to be, mixed together. You can't even differentiate one from the other.
The kill rate is averaging 37 a day nationwide, far outstripping that of the dead dictator Marcos.
It's just a lot of blood.
Yeah, like it's a rampage of nightly killings. The dead men obviously can't tell their tales, right? But what we can do is document them continuously so that they'll have a voice even after they're dead.
Luis Liwanag has been around the block. He cut his teeth in photojournalism in the early 1980s.
I started my career on the last stages of Marcos' rule.
Do you see parallels with what's happening now?
Yeah, I think there's parallel, and also because I think he looks up to the Marcoses. Duterte is becoming like an authoritarian. In Marcos' years, they tried to establish a society where there's chaos, and now it's happening again.
We commissioned Luis to film for Channel 4 News on 2 consecutive nights. He witnessed carnage.
One time we went through a lot of the dark alleys and then finally reached saw this really huge guy. It sprawled on the concrete, and we saw like 2 women crying in a dark alley, looking at the dead person who turned out to be their relative. When we saw them, they were in a corner, bunched together, and they were like shaking. It was really like a lot of blood. So immediately after the police left, he started sweeping away the blood.
The challenge: how to document a bloodbath and not focus on the gore.
Do you think there is another way to shoot this stuff?
Well, actually, there's no other. You have to run around, but still you have to take their pictures. I mean, people lying sprawled in their own blood, people close to them and who loves them, crying on the side. You have to really open your eyes and feel for them, because even if they're drug addicts, they're not really. I mean, they should be reformed or rehabilitated, and not just killed like insects.
That report from Jonathan Miller in Manila. Tonight's main news: the first convoys carrying hundreds of civilians out of rebel-held eastern Aleppo have left the city, although in the last half hour the UN Syria envoy has said that 50,000 people are still trapped. And he warned that not enough observers are in place to oversee the evacuations. And the US Secretary of State John Kerry has just been speaking to, accusing Assad government of carrying out nothing short of a massacre. And that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Very good evening to you.